On April 27th, in the middle of the cultural convention in Kabul, tanks rolled into the city, surrounded the presidential palace, and opened fire on the buildings and the regime of President Dawood. Air attacks followed. That night, tanks and men battled in the streets. Machine guns, artillery fire. Rumors, fear, death. By Saturday morning, April 29th, it was clear that the military coup d'etat had been successful. President Dawood had been killed and his government crushed. This is the postscript published in the 1978 edition of the yearbook of the Lahore American School in Pakistan. My name is Maha Hussein. I attended LAS from 1975 until I graduated in 1979. My school was one of 6 American schools that formed the South Asian Interscholastic Association. We had 4 schools in Pakistan, 1 in Afghanistan, 1 in New Delhi, India. All 6 schools met 4 times a year for soccer, basketball, softball, field hockey, and American football tournaments, as well as a cultural convention that usually took place at the last quarter of the year. We'd all been to Kabul in 1976 for a softball tournament, and we all remembered it as one of the most beautiful places that we'd ever seen. It was just absolutely heavenly, picturesque. Weather was very, very pleasant. It was just a beautiful place to be and a beautiful place to experience. We were in the auditorium of the American International School in Kabul, setting up for our multimedia show that evening, when our chaperones came in and ordered us out to the student center. We rushed across the courtyard and saw tanks outside the gate. Those of us who had noticed them immediately thought back of events we'd been through in Pakistan the previous year when Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was overthrown by Zia-ul-Haq, and when our lives and school year were put on hold for several weeks. In the student center, our teachers asked us to tell them where our host families lived and separated us according to 2 locations. Kabul had 4 affluent residential areas, namely Sharinau, Chicken Street, Kardasay, and Kardachar. Everyone who was being housed in the first 2 residential areas was moved to one side of the room, while the rest of us went to the other side. My host family, the director of USA to Afghanistan, and his wife and lovely daughter lived in Kardasay. They had me and a girl from Karachi American School staying with them. Our teachers then explained that everyone whose host family lived in the first 2 areas needed to be moved because they were too close to the bombing now town. The soon-to-be displaced kids were separated into 2 groups of upperclassmen and younger kids. Our teachers and U.S. Embassy staff members soon assigned a 9th grade girl and a 7th grade boy from my school, and my friend from Karachi was handed 4 younger kids from her school. A few minutes later, we had 3 kids from Murray Christian School and the International School of Islamabad added to our group. We were rushed out to buses and were sent home to our host families. At first, I didn't feel anything. We were all overwhelmed by everything that was happening and didn't have time to think or feel while running out to the buses or being driven home while trying to keep the kids quiet. Being the oldest kids in the house, our host family called me and my friend from Karachi in and told us what was going on. They asked us not to tell the younger kids and just try and keep them indoors at all times and busy with whatever games they had available in the house. We were also asked to help keep things in order during meal times. Unfortunately, we never managed to get the food on the table that first night because a nearby bombing shattered all the windows of the house and the adults rushed us all out to a woodshed in the garden. When things got quiet for a few minutes, we ran back to the house and grabbed enough food to keep everyone fed and watered through the night. The next day, we were allowed to spend a few minutes in the house to grab whatever we needed from the kitchen and extra jackets and blankets and clean clothes for all the displaced kids. Our host obviously had a way of finding out or getting information from outside. He and a colleague from the U.S. Embassy who were staying with us would venture into the house several times during the night and come back with news. We assumed they were either making calls or listening to the radio or watching TV. What we didn't know then was that all utilities were cut off. We could hear bombing, gunfire, shouting, and the occasional hair-raising scream. My friend from Karachi and I kept the younger kids busy with whatever silly games we could play in a very dimly lit woodshed. The first night was rather uneventful, other than asking the younger kids to keep it down from time to time and then forcing them to find a place to settle down for the night and actually sleeping. The mood was light, and we were hoping to go back to the house the following morning. Very early in the morning on April 29th, revolutionary soldiers killed the 2 chowkidars, or guards, outside my host family's gate. Marched across the garden, opened the woodshed, dragged us out, lined us up against the wall, and pointed their guns at us. Our host and his U.S. Embassy colleague were taken into the house, while the rest of us stared back at a bunch of nasty-looking men and their guns. My 2 young charges were on either side of me. The boy was okay standing very close, but didn't need to be held up, while I kept my arm around the girl's waist and pretty much held her shaking body up the entire 2 hours we were forced to stand there and wonder if we'd ever make it out of there alive. The soldiers ransacked the house, stole most of our clothes and all the canned food in the pantry, destroyed a lot of the furniture, and confiscated radio equipment they found in the basement. When my host's daughter's little fluff ball of a dog jumped out of her arms and yelped at one of the soldiers, he decided to shoot the poor animal for kicks and was rather delighted to see a bunch of hysterical kids wetting their pants. On May 2nd, we were all driven back to school at dawn out to get on our buses to go home. Saying goodbye to my host family was one of the most excruciating experiences of my then young life, and I got completely tongue-tied. I didn't know how to thank them. I didn't know what to say, and most of all, I hated thinking that we were leaving them behind. Later on, I found out that they were flown out to Germany that very same afternoon. Once we were all on the bus, one of the AISK teachers and a U.S. Embassy staff member came on to give us our final instructions, which were basically, don't move. We were told that we were being watched the entire time and were not allowed to leave our seats for any reason, and that even if we needed to use the bathroom, to please do so quietly in our seats and continue sitting on it, but that no big or sudden movements were permitted until we got across the border at Turkham. We were each handed a small paper bag that had a sandwich, a bag of potato chips, and a box of milk for the trip. More sandwiches were handed out to us while we were being given our orders, and we were told not to dig into our lunch bags for a few hours because we needed to make that food last until we got to Pakistan. The drive back took more than 13 hours because we were stopped at several checkpoints. Once at the border, we got off the AISK buses, which had to stay on Afghani soil, and we were instructed to walk across the border. The moment we hit Pakistani soil, some 250 plus angry, extremely obscene, but completely excused by their teachers, and very loud kids threw anything they could find across the way at the Afghani side. Turned around and walked away, not knowing just then that the city we all had fallen in love with was gone forever, and that none of us would ever see it again. Our delegation was picked up by a school bus sent by the International School in Islamabad following a lengthy pit stop in Peshawar, where we finally got a proper bathroom break. More snacks had been sent on the buses by families in Islamabad, but most of us still had our snack bags we were given in Kabul earlier that day. We arrived in Islamabad very late at night. I saw my father standing with ISI parents as we pulled into the U.S. Embassy parking lot. Dad, who worked at UNIDO in Lahore, had left Islamabad on April 28th, where the UNDP headquarters were on the same block as the U.S. Embassy, and where he managed to get updates every day until we returned. I thought he was there to pick me up and begged him to take me back to his hotel, but he told me that I needed to travel back to Lahore with my friends. The next day, we were driven to the train station where our school had booked an entire first-class compartment for us to ride home in comfort. Most of us were too exhausted to talk, and the trip was quiet for the most part. Shortly before we pulled into the train station in Lahore, our teachers asked us to draw all the curtains back and enjoy our homecoming. A few minutes later, we all went to bits at the sight of our entire student body, staff and administration, all of our parents, friends, and even the drivers and janitors from school, literally giving us a guard of honor on the platform. The train, which was scheduled to only stop for 5 minutes in Lahore, stopped for half an hour as everyone on the train wanted to take part in our celebrations. It was then when I finally let go and cried. And to this day, I still get emotional speaking, especially when I talk about this with old high school friends who shared the experience. At first, I didn't want to talk about it. I almost wanted to block it all out. The following year, when basketball season was over and everyone was talking about the trip to New Delhi for the cultural convention, those of us who had been to Kabul kept looking to each other to see if anyone would check it out. One of our teachers noticed how most of us didn't sign up for any convention activities and then pointed out to those of us who were graduating that year that this was our last trip with the school and that we needed to leave on a high note. There were 7 seniors at the convention who were gifted an overnight stay in Agra to visit the Taj Mahal at night with a full moon. After a late dinner at night, we all decided to sit outside our hotel rooms in the garden where eventually we all remembered and talked about Kabul, the city we fell in love with in 1976. How did this change me as a person? I guess it did in a really big way. I grew up really fast on that morning on April 29th. I'd been a very, very emotional person up until that point. But that morning, I stopped. I kept my emotions in check. I was strong for the younger kids. I was strong for everybody around me. I was strong because I had promised my host that I would be strong. And I've carried this throughout my entire life.